what are the components of being overwhelmed? You may be taking on too much. There may be too much information coming in, or there may be some big thing all at once that just hits you and overwhelms you at one moment. And all of those things are kind of life being thrown at you. But when those things are thrown at you, when you're feeling those big things coming at you, and you already are putting yourself in the environment where you are, taking on too much, well, then that's only going to be overwhelming. So the first key part of that is to separate out the things that you can control and the things you can't. Hey everyone, welcome to Flow Over Fear, and today we are continuing the conversation that we have been having about our limiting beliefs and how we can rise above them to realize our true potential. Now, limiting beliefs are really manifestations of our fears. I mean, fear is that root feeling that we're experiencing that feels like an obstacle to us reaching that next level or reaching the true potential that we feel, or bridging the gap between where we're at now and where we want to be in our lives. And I talked about a couple of weeks ago that there are really three root causes to those innermost fears that we have that prevent us from becoming our absolute best. And the three root fears that we experience are uncertainty, overwhelm, and self-doubt. Last week, we touched on uncertainty, and we talked about ways in which you can rise above or overcome uncertainty in your life to find conviction. And in that conviction, we actually find the way that we get over that uncertainty is to find certainty in the now with conviction, with finding our core values. And today, I want to touch on the overwhelm side of it. Now, overwhelm is something you could probably resonate with because every single one of us has dealt with overwhelm sometime in our life. We've been overwhelmed by too much work. We've been overwhelmed by too much stimulus coming in. We felt overwhelmed with sickness or whatever it may be, but overwhelm is an important component in our lives. And when we get overwhelmed to the point that it is affecting us that we can no longer take no more, we burn out, right? Have you ever been burned out? Have you ever felt like you have nothing left to give and you're just done? You burn out, and then, your body kind of takes over. You feel sick, you feel achy, and you just feel like there's nothing left to give. That's overwhelm. And overwhelm is that physical, a lot of times, manifestation of that innermost limiting beliefs, the feeling that, or the fears, or the way that we act in terms of trying to approach the things that we have now. And a lot of times the way we act in response to the fears may overwhelm us. In my own life, I've experienced overwhelm a lot in my life. And this really, really dates back to when I was a child, when, I said no to a lot of the things that pushed me up against the edge of my comfort zone. I said no to playing football when I was younger, and because I was afraid of being hit. I said no to stepping into the pitch so I could hit the ball when I played baseball because I was afraid of being hit by the ball. I said no to talking to the girls that I liked because I was afraid of rejection. I said no to a lot of things out of fear. And because of that, my comfort zone, my capacity for comfort began to diminish because I wasn't expanding it. I wasn't growing that muscle. And so it crept down and down and down and down and down. So that by the time I was in college and I was already starting to use alcohol as a coping mechanism for a lot of that fear, I already had a comfort zone that was very small. I was already living in a pretty small world where I was not willing to step too far outside of my comfort zone. And yet I set myself up in such a way to be overwhelmed in my life. And that happened in college when I would start a quarter, and this may happen to a lot of people, especially people who want to achieve a lot of things. I found myself signing up for a lot of classes because I wanted to be done with college sooner, or I wanted to be done with the coursework, or I wanted to get through it and get on to whatever was next. And so I would sign up for like 20 units in a quarter and just think, yeah, I'll manage it somehow. And of course, every single quarter I would be getting C's and D's and maybe sometimes even failing out because I didn't have the necessary focus on those subjects to actually succeed. And it got to the point where I was studying for an organic chemistry exam, one of the 5 classes that I had in that quarter in college. And by the way, organic chemistry, I mean, if it doesn't sound intimidating, it should sound intimidating. It was one of the most difficult classes I took, and it showed. But I was also taking that amidst like 4 or 5 other classes that were equally hard. And so I was studying for this organic chemistry exam, and I just became overwhelmed while I was studying with this immense panic attack. I collapsed to the floor in panic because I was certain that I had this horrible, deadly disease. Of course, I didn't. There was no reason for me to assume that, but my brain just attached to that idea with so much certainty that I collapsed to the floor in terror, paralyzed with fear, sobbing uncontrollably for like the next hour. And that fear, even though the fear was anchoring itself in something that was totally irrational, some horrible, deadly disease that I didn't have, what that really meant, that panic really meant, was it was telling me that I was burned out and I was unhealthy and I was pushing myself too hard on something, and I didn't have the capacity to do what I was doing. I was severely overwhelmed, and I was coping in unhealthy ways using alcohol and cigarettes and unhealthy food and no exercise and all of that stuff. And so yeah, I burned out. I had a panic attack, and those panic attacks persisted with me for the next few years. That's all to say that, that overwhelm could come from time to time when we put ourselves in situations, and when we create an environment for ourselves that we are just taking on too much stimulus, that there's too much stimulus coming in, or there's too much burden on our shoulders, or we're just taking on too much because we think, yeah, at the beginning, we think, yeah, I got this. But really, we don't necessarily have it. And it's okay to not have it all the time. It's okay to not be able to handle it, as long as you can have the tools to overcome that overwhelm. Now, community is a big part of overcoming overwhelm, because you can lean into a community, whether it be a therapist or and a therapist is a good start too. If you're feeling that on an ongoing basis, someone you can talk to, someone you could share your feelings or your problems or your challenges with, who can listen in a trusted space. That's a good start. But you can also have a trusted group of friends or a mastermind or coworkers or people that you can lean on, especially maybe to take some of those burdens off of you if you're feeling it. Asking for help is another way to do that. But today, and so unloading some of the things that you have in the moments where you're feeling overwhelmed are ways to combat the overwhelm that you're feeling in the moment. Because once you're feeling overwhelmed, there's no doubt about it, you already have too much stimulus coming in. You already have too much on your shoulders. You have to unload some of that. So you have to give up some of whatever's there, or attack it slowly, or whatever you need to do to get get whatever's overwhelming off of your plate. And you have to get the rest that you need in order to fight that overwhelm. So rest is always, always, always best. So those are some things, but I want to talk first about how we can combat that overwhelm before it even hits us. And over time, actually expand our capacity to build that comfort zone that we have, so that as we're growing out, as we're achieving things, we can expand our capacity to take on whatever we need to take on. Now, it's important that this capacity that we're building is built in such a way that we're not constantly putting ourselves at the red line. That, that's, you listen to the David Gogginses of the world, or the people that are telling us to give everything we've got all the time, 110% every single moment of every day. That's a recipe for burnout. That's a recipe for overwhelm, and that's not going to do anybody any good. That's what angers me about the messages that are being put out there right now, is they're encouraging you to put yourself in an unhealthy situation where you overwhelm yourself, where you push yourself beyond your limits too often, too far, too hard, and you burn out. And the worst part about it is that when you fail, because you're pushing too hard, too far past your comfort zone, the worst part about that is you're led to believe that it's your fault for not being disciplined enough or not having the willpower enough to keep going. But it's not your fault. That's not your fault. The problem is in the other messages we hear, and we need to take it back. And we need to talk a little bit more. We need to change the conversation so that we talk about how we can actually get to the points of building our capacity and not just redlining it all the time. You don't have to redline your life to build your capacity. And I want to talk to you about how we can do that. And the answer, so if the pain that comes with overwhelm is burnout, if the pain that we're feeling is that slow growth, that is that burnout, then the solution to that is that we find discipline. Discipline is one of the ways in which we can find success beyond that burnout or that overwhelm. And I want to talk to you about how that is, because a lot of times when you're overwhelmed, I mean, the truth of the reality is, what are the components of being overwhelmed? You may be taking on too much. There may be too much information coming in, or there may be some big thing all at once that just hits you and overwhelms you at one moment. And all of those things are kind of life being thrown at you. But when those things are thrown at you, when you're feeling those big things coming at you, and you already are putting yourself in the environment where you are, taking on too much, well, then that's only going to be overwhelming. So the first key part of that is to separate out the things that you can control and the things you can't. So the things you can control, like take my college experience, for example. The things I could control in that moment were the number of courses that I signed up for. I could have signed up for fewer courses, given myself some capacity, but I didn't. I signed up for 20 units or whatever it was, and I maximized, redlined my capacity. Now, did that make any room for the things that I couldn't control? The things that might hit me from the outside, the things like, well, I have a busy day at work, or I might be feeling sick, or my family calls and there's an emergency, something like that. No, I didn't have the capacity. It was already at the red line. So the only next step was burning out. But if we can control the things that we can control to a greater degree, that sets us up to build that capacity to manage the things that might be outside of our control. Discipline is a way we do that. And so let's talk about discipline. So discipline is really focus. Like, right? We know that discipline, we have to be focused on something to be disciplined. We also inherently know that discipline requires consistency, that we be consistent with pursuing it. Right? So we inherently know those two pieces about discipline: focus and consistency. Well, the thing about focus and consistency is that's not just the definition for discipline, that's also the definition for willpower. But willpower is something that dies when our force of will dies, right? Like, we lose our willpower when our force of will dies. So what's the difference between discipline and willpower? Well, when you look at willpower is that idea that we're focused on something. We're doing it consistently. But ultimately, over time, we run out of juice. We run out. So that implies that with willpower, there's also a third element. There's an element that we're pushing as hard as we can for as long as we can. That's willpower. Willpower is focus plus consistency plus pushing as hard as you can. Now, what happens in that is when you can no longer push as hard as you can, you fail. You fall short, you burn out. With discipline, however, let's look at that third element. We have focus. We have focus plus consistency. Plus, there's another element there with discipline that we often neglect, And that piece of discipline that we neglect is that we have to slow down. We slow down. So when we slow down, we actually give ourselves the capacity to stay consistent for an infinite amount of time. So discipline is infinite, while willpower fades over time or falls off a cliff or we burn out. And that's why discipline is one of the key antidotes or one of the key preventative measures for overwhelm, for preventing overwhelm. Discipline is a preventative measure for overwhelm. That's what I want to talk about. So you practice discipline with something before you get overwhelmed. We talked earlier about how you can the antidotes to overwhelm. You need to rest, you need to step back, you need to unload those things. But in the process of preventing overwhelm from happening, discipline is one of those things. So let's break that down a bit. Let's talk about focus. Because let's first take a step back and actually talk about the antithesis of discipline. Because you may be wondering, well, what does discipline have to do with overwhelm? That doesn't really make sense. Well, when you think about the opposite of discipline, well, if you think about the opposite of focus, consistency, and slowing down, think about the times when you feel overwhelmed. You may be distracted, right? That's the opposite of focus. You may feel like things are inconsistent, like you can't consistently get to things, like things are slipping through the cracks, or you're falling behind, or you can't keep up, so you're inconsistent. And that's the opposite of consistency. And then you also, when you're feeling like you're overwhelmed, you feel like you have to rush through things. You feel like you're rushed. You feel like you have to push as hard as you can. And rushed is the opposite of slowing down. So that's why I believe that discipline is one of the greatest preventative measures to overwhelm. If you can be disciplined with the right things, and that's a key component too, is you have to be disciplined with the right things in order to pursue that. So are you disciplined with the right things to prevent that overwhelm? And that's all associated with, are you disciplined with the things that we talked about in uncertainty, the things that you're convicted about that make you certain? So see how the two go hand in hand. You find that conviction in the face of uncertainty, and then you pursue it with discipline. So let's first talk about focus. Focus is all about choosing wisely. Now, choosing wisely is less about what you say yes to. It's more about what you say no to. And this is especially true to people who are achievers, leaders, people who have enormous amounts of responsibility. If you're leading an organization, or if you're trying to be an entrepreneur or pursue something, it is very easy to get a diluted focus because you have a lot of stimulus coming in. You have a lot of emails. You have a lot of things coming at you. This is one of those interesting things that happens in life, because early in life, when you're building your career, a lot of times when you're first starting out, you may be pushing yourself and applying yourself to add that value that you need to get noticed or to move ahead or to get that. So you're actually putting more effort on yourself. But there's a switch that flips once you get a lot of that responsibility, or you get the position, or you get the role, where that switch is flipped and things just start coming onto you and things start getting onto you. So the idea of saying yes to things, you actually need to switch the narrative and start saying no to more things. The idea of focus and choosing wisely is less about the things you say yes to and more about the things you say no to. You need to rigorously say no to the things that are not serving the big goal, the thing that you're convicted about. Because saying no to those things is going to focus your energy on the right things, the things that will. Derek Sievers, who started CD Baby and has this rule that he says that if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. And I think that's a valuable rule, and it's one that I fail at many, many times. I'm terrible at saying no. And so I naturally get overwhelmed a lot because I don't say no to a lot of things. But the art of saying no to the things that aren't serving the greater good are the things that are going to help you to prevent overwhelm. It's going to help you to stay focused. And that helps you on that first element of discipline. Say no to the right things. Learn to say no, rigorously say no to what's not serving your big convicted goal. And the second part is consistency. And I think intuitively, we all know that discipline requires consistency, but we also fall short on this consistency piece a lot of times. Think about when you try to start a fitness program or a new business program or whatever it may be, or you start a business. What is the first thing that happens when you get excited about that? Well, if you're like me, you try to do it all at once at the very beginning, right? you try to tackle everything. It's like how I was when I got into college and I wanted to take 20 units this quarter and achieve everything. The problem was I was setting myself up for failure. When we take on too much at the very beginning, we make it impossible for ourselves to stay consistent because we're putting ourselves into the world of willpower, but we need to stay in the domain of discipline. So the idea with consistency is to plan well and start well. Starting well requires that you start off at a lower capacity than you think. You have to create an effective plan that leaves capacity for your growth. You have to leave capacity on the table. That may sound counterintuitive because, well, what about what that added capacity that I have may go away. So why would I leave that capacity there? Well, because the truth is that we push our capacity outward when we push out far away from our comfort zone, so far away from the edge of our red line. So you want to start, you build the capacity by leaving capacity on the table. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. If you want to build capacity in your life, you have to leave capacity first. That means starting out smaller than you think you need to. What I should have done in college was maybe take 12 credits, 3 courses, and done really well with them, aced them. Because what would have happened there is I would have had the capacity to focus intently. I would have said no to the right things. I would have focused intently on the things that would have taught me the foundational principles that would have helped me in those future classes, instead of rigorously failing my way through 20 units and falling short. I could have learned the foundations, had more capacity to take a higher number of units later when I had those foundational principles in place. But I did it backwards. And a lot of us do it backwards. A lot of us take it on like when we first start a fitness routine or a business plan. We decide that we're gonna make 20 hours worth of calls today, and we're gonna do 20 hours of work today, and we're gonna keep doing 20 hours of work until we get the momentum. But the problem is that we start to burn out over time because we can't stay consistent with that. So find that sustainable level at which you can be consistent. When you plan well and you create the level you create the plan where you're leaving capacity on the table at the beginning, you're actually creating capacity for yourself in the long term. The final piece is the counterintuitive piece. This is the piece that people often neglect about discipline, but it's probably the most important part. In order to stay consistent, we need to slow down. We need to slow down. We can't go full force and full speed ahead on everything. And this goes counter to what we learn from the vast majority of people delivering these messages in our mainstream today that are saying, give everything you've got, give 110%. This is where my 80% rule comes into play, which is start by giving 80% consistently. Because at 80%, you can give 80% consistently. Then your capacity grows as you give that 80%. If you slow down, you build that 80%. And over time, your 80% is going to become everyone else's 110%. Think about it in the terms of martial arts. I've been practicing karate for a while now, and for about 2 years now. And one of the things is as we started out, most of the forms that we learn, we do very slowly, without much effort, without putting a lot of effort into those moves. Like we'll kick very slowly, and we'll do it repetitively over time. We'll keep kicking, so that over time actually our kicks gain more power, and we actually have the ability to use those forms as muscle memory in other forms, and everything becomes better. And and over time, when you look at a black belt, like doing a form, it's incredibly beautiful, it's incredibly powerful and graceful, and there's so much speed there. But that all started with a single kick as a white belt, like a single slow moving kick. And once that muscle memory was built, the capacity was added, the capacity was created, the capacity was created, so that a black belt giving their 80% is basically, the equivalent of, somebody else giving, way over 100%. It's just amazing how your capacity can grow over time. And if you think about it that way, if you can grow your capacity outward, you're slowly pushing your comfort zone outward so that you're expanding your world. The world that I was creating that was really small because I was running from fear and I was pushing it away, and I created this small world so that becoming overwhelmed wasn't hard for me. It happened quite often because I was always being kind of way pushed outside my comfort zone. But now, having expanded that gradually by being disciplined in this way, building that capacity, I've expanded to a point where I can take on much more. I can achieve much more. And the people that might be saying that I'm, that it's impossible to learn things in a short amount of time. Well, I'm able to learn things faster, and where you're able to learn things faster and apply skills faster because you have a strong foundation of those skills and a big capacity to lean into. That all comes with starting out by being disciplined on the small things. Discipline is that preventative measure that can prevent overwhelm over the long term. If you practice that, if you start with focusing, which is choosing wisely, if you could practice it with consistency, which means leaving capacity on the table when you start and as you go, and that you slow down, you can find that discipline creates the capacity for you to take on more, to achieve more, and to overcome the overwhelm that you might feel. So that is the way that we prevent it. And of course, there's other things, and I didn't mention the obvious things that we can fight with overwhelm, because there's a lot of elements that we need to look into with overwhelm. I mean, there's overwhelm that hits us in a big chunk all at once. We could have a huge medical issue that is just overwhelming, and I'm not minimizing those things, because those things we have to address with a trusted therapist or resource or what have you. We also have to rest our bodies. Rest is so important. But in the grand scheme of things, preventative measure to preventing overwhelm with the things that we can control, discipline is the way we do that. If you focus on discipline, you'll build your capacity, and you'll create more opportunity to learn, to accelerate learning, accelerate mastery, and really achieve the things that you want to achieve. And so that, talking about the overwhelm this week, talking about uncertainty last week. Next week, we're going to get into self-doubt, and that's a big one. But if we can overcome that limiting belief as well, and that psychological barrier, if you can unlock the freedom beyond that, man, the world is your oyster. So go out there, practice discipline. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next time. Hey, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you've been listening for a while, you know how important community and mentorship is to living a life of abundance above your fears. If you want to connect with me, hear about new offerings, episodes, and strategies to live with conviction, courage, and clarity, then sign up for my newsletter now. It's a way to stay connected to me outside of social media and bring a little empowerment to your inbox, and maybe a few dad jokes here and there. Sign up now at adamcliffordhill.com. Now back to the show. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Flow Over Fear podcast. If you'd like to learn more about getting into flow and learn the foundations of flow, I have a free video series on my website at www.adamcliffordhill.com called The Foundations of Flow. Feel free to go there and download it and start your journey to rising above fear and achieving greater flow in your life. And if you like this episode, and I'm guessing you did if you stuck around for this long, then please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, and you will receive notifications when I have new interviews, new recaps, and new trainings that pop up on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us.